So good afternoon, everybody. People will continue to file in. There's the elevator that you saw, so we'll just get this party started. So I'm Ty Gregory. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council, JCRC, for the Bay Area. And the conversation that we're going to have is really something core to the work that I personally believe in and the work that JCRC does day to day, which is we're in the business of building friendships. And a lot of us have felt tested by that over the past 14, 15 months. So before we dive in, let's poll the audience. Let's start with the positive. After October 7th, were there people in your lives that you didn't expect, that called, texted, reached out to you from various parts of your life and said, I'm thinking about you, I hope you're okay? Raise your hand if that happened to you. Okay. But it did happen, right? I like to start with the positive. Now let's flip the question, which is, were there people in your life that you expected to hear from outside of our community that were met with radio silence after October 7th? Okay. So that's probably why you chose this session, because we're all looking for answers, and I think we're going to get some provided.
You're not going to say your friends that harassed you incessantly to go flip for the other side?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about them. They're special. But I think it's important to hold both, right? And maybe it does take more courage to be an ally of our community right now, but we owe it to think about them too, because we need some hope. But we need to also think seriously about what's happened over the past 14 months, and more importantly, what led up to that that's leaving us, in large part, grasping for straws about where our friends have been. So the way that I want to start off this conversation is actually to have our panelists introduce themselves by giving a little bit of a storytelling about what things have been like through this bridge-building lens over the past 14 months for them. So for start, we're going to go to April Powers. Tell us what these past 14 months have been like for you.
So I am a Black Jewish woman who was canceled after the last Hamas conflict. I have led DEI for some of the largest companies in the world, and when I spoke about anti-Semitism for the first time, I was canceled. So I've already experienced what that was. And so after October 7th, and I do work in Jewish communal spaces with my organization, Jewbian Princess, and I teach anti-Semitism with Project Shema. But I go into corporations and nonprofits and other spaces to talk about anti-Semitism and how Jews and Jewish identity fit into DEI spaces. So I work in coalition and in conversation with a lot of different groups. And October 7th was a bit of a trickle, I feel. Like people just didn't know what to say. There were a few things here and there, like how are you doing? No bad reposting from close friends of mine, a couple of bad reposting from different people. And I just, for my own mental health, having gone through this already, I decided for some people I was gonna unfollow them for my own mental health. And then there was the Black Jewish solidarity stuff for me, which, you know, Black Twitter didn't stand up for me in 2021, so I wasn't expecting Black Twitter to stand up for me. I know that surprised a lot of people. But what was delicious, as you come around the corner, is there are Black folks standing up and speaking out in support of the Jewish community. Van Jones is one of them. Believe it or not, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, is, what? Oh, get ready. You're gonna hear some different voices on this panel. It has co-launched an entire Black Jewish solidarity community that I'm a part of. She is putting a ton of time, effort, and resources. I heard a Black trans woman say, when I go out and speak, I speak up for everybody. And when I go out to speak out as a Black trans woman, nobody stands up for me. And I see the same thing happening to my Jewish brothers and sisters over there. So when it started as a trickle, I have been harassed by close friends that are no longer invited to my funeral. And if you think I'm kidding, I called every close person. I was like, he is not allowed at my funeral, just know that. So yeah, the worst thing for me, the worst betrayals were from close friends. The surprises really warmed my heart and soul. And so it gave me so much hope for humanity. And as Jewish people, it gives me hope for redemption because I believe in redemption. If we cancel people forever, I'm anti-cancel culture, I always have been, which is one of the reasons why if you say, what, Patrisse Cullors? Yeah. But she had also left Black Lives Matter before the parachute. I'm pretty sure she did. Somebody can fact check me on that, yeah. Anyway, does that answer?
You did great. I just want to add to that really quickly, which is we have amazing Black leadership in San Francisco that have been great for the Jewish community. Our district attorney, Brooke Jenkins in San Francisco, rock star. You know, she prosecuted the Golden Gate Bridge protesters. She stood for Jewish public safety. London Breed, she was voted out of office. She's been a very vocal supporter of the Jewish community. By the way, discovered she's half Ashkenazi a few years ago during COVID, took a 23andMe test. So don't say that we don't have strong pro-Jewish Black leaders, even here in the Bay Area, which is a challenging area, right? So it's important to treat no community like a monolith.
At all. Except, and when we're talking about Black Jewish solidarity, please don't, how many Black Jews do we have up in here? Please don't forget us. We're like the ones having these conversations at our Thanksgiving tables. And I could go through every single multi-ethnic Jew and then we'd have somebody from each section here. So that is another thing, that people have these conversations in these silos of Blacks or Jews, and they're not thinking like Black Jews live at the intersection, and we're having the difficult conversations quite regularly. So
Amen.
I had to say that.
Amen. Alana, I want to make sure we all give you another round of applause for what you said on stage.
Is this on? Yeah, okay.
It's
Thank
on.
you.
You gave us so much of your heart-wrenching story up there, but you are living in New York. And so you're having conversations with your concentric circles of dear friends, acquaintances, colleagues, et cetera. Play out the last 14 months as you've made the case, as you've lived this reality.
Yeah.
How have you experienced it?
Oh, how have I experienced this? It has been, I can say for sure that I am not the same person I was on October 6th. My entire life changed on October 7th, but I was already very aware of, especially in like young liberal, I used to work at BuzzFeed, like in young liberal millennial kind of progressive spaces, that the Palestinian cause had become very important to that community. And in the war with Gaza in 2021, I had already felt people around me sort of turning their backs while rockets were hitting Nil Oz. My family luckily wasn't there at that point. And I was like, what's going on here? But I was, as an American Jew, as someone who lives here, was able to kind of like coast, because it's not part of the everyday discourse in our culture usually. On October 7th, I knew that that was going to happen again. I remember I looked back actually recently. I started posting on Instagram literally on October 7th, being like, my family is missing. They are gone. And I remember I looked back and I shared something where I said, this is not resistance. This is a terrorist attack. This is not resistance. And my initial experience in the beginning was being a New Yorker and living in Brooklyn and walking around my very liberal spaces and feeling very lonely and very confused, walking into coffee shops and not knowing if I could put up a poster in there. And my brother and I would put posters up around Brooklyn and of our family's faces, right? And they would be torn down instantaneously. And I saw, of course, I got, on a positive note, a flood of messages from people who I hadn't spoken to since college, like tons of people sending me messages to express their love and their support. My Palestinian friend, whose family lives in Haifa, messaged me immediately to share her concern. But it was other people in New York, people who have no skin in the game, as we say, who very quickly turned their backs. I also live in Bed-Stuy, in a very Black community. And one of the local communities on that day, I remember, put out a statement supporting it as resistance. And I was horrified. And this was an eye-opening moment for me, because I thought to myself, how are we living in this world? Because how have people dehumanized Israelis or celebrated resistance to the degree at which they think taking my family hostage, the children, the babies in my family, that could be justified, and how could they do so quickly? And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, about my confusion about why no one in my community could help me hold my grief. But what this moment did for me was it demanded that I ask questions. Rather than saying, well, forget all of them, I said, why are they acting this way? What is happening? And I started to ask myself these questions. What have I been missing? Not that anything that was coming from the far left is justified by any means, but in order to take that, and there is something happening that got to that place. And so I started to ask questions, and I started to ask myself, why don't I have any more Palestinian friends? Why don't I have Palestinian allies? Can I speak to someone from Gaza? Because the people of Gaza and the hostages are two sides of the same coin. And I started to question myself, and I started to seek out Palestinians, people in the peace activism world, Israelis. Israelis for Peace is an organization who kind of started after October 7th in New York. And I started to develop relationships with the enemy. And I have an incredible amount of Palestinians in my life now, people who support me, support the hostages, people who don't agree with on a lot of things. There are many things we don't agree with, and sometimes they say things that I don't like that make me uncomfortable, and sometimes I say things to them that make them really uncomfortable. But I feel that, one, we had to show unity, that the people of Gaza and the hostages, they need to be saved together. There's no separating them in this. And the same goes for Israelis and Palestinians. There is no future without Israelis, and there is no future without Palestinians. So it's our job to work across our divide and to sit and have those really uncomfortable conversations and make friends with people who were once our enemies.
It's really beautiful. Thank you. Isabella Tabarovsky, you're a senior fellow with the Z3 Institute. Tell us about what the past 14 months have been like for you.
So first of all, I want to say that I have a background that perhaps makes this whole notion of allyship a little bit more complex in my worldview. So I grew up in the USSR, moved to the US 35 years ago almost, and then the last 4 years I've lived in Israel. So I was in Israel when October 7th happened. And so the interactions with people outside the Jewish community were few. I, of course, noticed, who sent me messages, who didn't send me messages, but it wasn't such a big a priority. The thing about it is the thing about allyships, and as I used to think about it even before, I write a lot about the experience of Russian-speaking Jews, RSJs, ex-Soviet Jews, people who grew up in the USSR or come out of families that come out of the USSR. And I think I feel pretty comfortable saying on behalf of the community that in general, this group did not really expect progressives, the far left groups, to be our allies. And I think that there are many reasons for that, but I think that American-born American Jews look toward, have been kind of, educated and trained and conditioned to look exclusively toward the right as the greatest source of danger. Whereas if you come out of the USSR, you understand the danger from the far left really, really well. And the language that we have been hearing over the last few years, and especially since October 7th, this whole anti-Zionist language, this is what I write about a lot, the equation between Zionism and racism and apartheid and Nazism and fascism and colonialism and imperialism, this is the stuff of our childhoods. I mean, I came of age, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. To me, I feel like I'm back in the USSR, honestly, when I hear this language here. And so when RSJs like myself look to the left and it was very hard for us to overlook the anti-Israel language, the anti-Zionist language, and to continue to view those groups as allies. And so my overwhelming emotion in the wake of October 7th in this regard, aside from the trauma and everything else, was just profound sadness at seeing and recognizing the betrayal from my American-born Jewish friends. It reminded me of the experience. I once went to the Washington Holocaust Museum in DC. There was an exhibit years ago called Some Were Neighbors. And it talked about how German Jews, like one of the most painful experiences for them that they discussed after the Holocaust and told their interviewers about, that was this sense of that suddenly their German friends just disappeared, like their dance partners and their friends in their choirs and their, I don't know, lovers probably, you know, school friends. Suddenly they disappeared. And that sense of betrayal, think about it, they carried it through like this is after the Holocaust, after the horror of the Holocaust, they still remembered the betrayal. And after October 7th, I just felt really, really sad and crushed to see that our community was yet again living through a betrayal and that we allowed it to happen. And so I've been thinking a lot about, you know, how do we choose our friends, who do we turn to, and we'll probably get to that.
Thank you. And I'm going to give my own truncated answer to this. Some of you know me as the head of JCRC, but for a long time I've been part of the LGBTQ Jewish community. And I personally, and many of my friends, I see Justin's here, have had stories about having slurs, anti-Jewish slurs, anti-Semitic slurs leveled at us in gay bars, in the Castro, in West Hollywood, in Chelsea, in New York. And that is a feeling of isolation. At the same time, so many of my friends have come out of the woodwork to support me. You know, I heard from dates from, I don't know, like 8 years ago, texted me. I haven't heard from that. Maybe I didn't want to hear from them again, but they're like, I'm so sorry for what happened. So there's two sides of the same coin, but it's really troubling to me. Some of you know about Senator Scott Wiener in San Francisco, who's been the most vocal supporter of Israel in the LGBTQ community, perhaps on the Western states. And some of you read there was a pumpkin carving that he did for his constituents. Every election cycle, he has a pumpkin carving fundraiser, and there were kids there. And Queers United Against Israeli Terrorism, QUIT, as they call themselves. Quit what? I don't know. Drugs? Okay. So they basically did a march to this pumpkin carving, and actually the inverse of what they intended happened, because there were parents there that knew nothing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, had no position on the war, and these people were yelling at kids. And so that we have seen a process of dehumanization where Jews or people that associate with us have become legitimate targets because they've convinced themselves we're no longer human as Zionists or as Jews. And that's a process that we've seen repeated itself. So I decided early on after October 7th that I would not be a Jew with trembling knees, that I was going to show the community who I was, and that our community needs to show our broader surroundings who we are, and let's let the rest fall into place. Those that admire who we are and see us celebrating our Jewishness will gravitate towards us, and the others will see them for exactly who they are. And that's kind of been my theory of change over the past year plus, and I think my mantra as we try to figure out the way forward, and that's what we want to talk about next. So before we get to the outside world, I think it's really important that we take the temperature of where Jewish unity is today. Because we've talked on the main stage and over lunch, there's so many ways to feel good about how united we are right now. But there are those underlying fissures that seem to like they're coming back to the surface, or maybe they never really went away, or maybe we papered over them in that moment of trauma, or that continues to be traumatic. How do we view this moment in time in terms of Jewish unity? What internal bridge building do we think that we need to do right now? Let's go in the reverse order.
Sure. So internal bridge building is something that's very near and dear to my heart because I've really spent a lot of time, again, explaining, I think, the RSJ experience because I felt like it was really important. The one thing about RSJs that's really important for the current moment is that we are unapologetically Zionist and unapologetically pro-Israel. And I saw it already in 2021. I wrote an article about that then, where you could see during that conflict with between Israel and Gaza at that time, ex-Soviet Russian-speaking Jews were out there with Israeli flags and just arguing with the anti-Zionists, while a lot of born American Jews were shocked, because that's when kind of that anti-Israel rhetoric really began to explode. So I think that there are communities in our broader community that perhaps should be brought more into the center. And I think that this is one group. I think Iranian, Persian Jews need to be brought more into the center, I think. But I want to just say about unity. I think, look, I think we as a people, as a Jewish people, it's in our book, right? We're an argumentative people, right? We all have opinions. We argue with one another. We even argue with God. So the question is, how do we define unity? I think that this kind of our habit and our skill at disagreeing serves us well. And actually, Nat Wilf, who many of you probably know who she is, she likes to say, when people say, well, Israel, Jewish or democratic, and she would say that, I hope I'm not misquoting her, but she would say that essentially Jewish cannot be anything but democratic, because we're arguing with one another. We are, we have that culture, we have that habit. I think that it's one of our strengths. I think it's excellent that we are, I think we could do better at allowing more different opinions, more diversity of opinion within our community. But I think in general, it's our strength. The question is, at what point do we get to a place where disagreement becomes animosity, right? At what point are we at each other's throats to where we start to fear like we're really falling apart as a people? So somewhere in there, I think we need to find a line that we shouldn't be crossing. And I think perhaps we need a certain mindset adjustment where at the top of our list of priorities, we place peoplehood, right? Jewish peoplehood. And it's going to sound like a cliche, but really like, brotherly feelings toward each other or love toward one another. Like that needs to be at the top. And I think that is something that our community leaders really need to prioritize, because, as everything began polarizing over the last few years, we saw, including our spiritual leaders, taking political positions and demonizing and excluding others. So I think that guarding this kind of overarching understanding that the wholeness of the Jewish people is critical, I think that's really important.
So our community is fractured, and it's fractured generationally, it's fractured across political divides. And people are having a really hard time talking to each other. I've spoken to a lot of people who, have an anti-Zionist, let's say, nephew who won't speak to them at all. And at the same time, you have people who are anti-Zionist saying, well, I just want to be heard. And if they say anything about ending the occupation or criticize Israel's actions in Gaza, they're shut out by Zionist Jews. So we're not talking to each other, and we have to talk to each other because neither of us are going anywhere. I have done a lot of outreach in the peace community, which has led me to people who identify as things like non-Zionist and post-Zionist. I recently, or at some point a few months ago, I actually, I polled people on my Instagram, and I think it was like 12% of the people following me are people who identify as either non-Zionist or post-Zionist or anti-Zionist, which most of them don't like. I think we are doing a disservice by not having conversations with each other. I don't see how we can ask people to stand with us as a community if we are not increasing alignment with each other about our history, so that JVP stops revising our history, or they are seen as doing such. And at the same time, I think we have to allow anti-occupation voices, anti-occupation Israeli voices, actual voices of peace, because they're in Israel. They're not so much in America, but they're really in Israel. And so we have to bring groups like Omdim B'Yachad, Standing Together, to the forefront, or at least to have them be heard by more Zionist Jews in America, for example. And so this all led me to figuring out, like, asking myself, how are we going to do this? And I came upon a rabbi, as one does in my kind of journey, who ran a program called the Narrow Bridge Project at Brown University. And she started it there to bring the anti-Zionists and Zionist Jews together to have curriculum-based, facilitated dialogue. And the program worked phenomenally. The students aligned. I don't like to say consensus, because the truth is, are we ever going to all agree on everything? No. But we need to increase alignment on our peoplehood, on Zionism, on anti-Semitism and Israel-Palestine, so that we can work more effectively and our activism becomes more effective. Because, for example, an anti-Zionist Jew, let's call them, if they're in spaces, they should be able to fight for us too. They should be able to fight for Jewish peoplehood, and they're not. And this requires a level of education, but also dialogue and relationship building. We have to build relationships with one another again and learn to develop a lot more respect for each other so that we can actually move forward in unity, not uniformity.
Thank you. So we're 15 million people. 1.5, we know this. 0.2% of the world's population, which means most people have never met a Jew. And we cannot afford this, my friends. I can't speak to the political divides in Israel. I don't live there. I'm headed there next month if anyone's going to be there. But here in the US alone, just this past election, I don't know, how many of you are not speaking to friends or family post-election? How many of you are worried about Thanksgiving or Pesach or any of the holidays post-election? So I think we cannot afford to allow, especially our political divides. I know that many of us are disappointed, and that's a very nice word, in some of the decisions that friends and family have made in this past election cycle, whatever your politics. But to allow that to stop us from reaching across the aisle for unity, not uniformity, is a big mistake. We have to figure out, maybe one table at a time, how to have those conversations. We have to get in the same dictionary also. What does Zionism mean to you? Because even with Jewish young people, sometimes I'm like, what is Zionism? When you're saying you're an anti-Zionist, what does that mean to you? I'm anti-occupation, great, okay. Well, what does occupation mean to you? Well, it's the West Bank. Okay, so you're a Zionist, my friend. Right, so I also think, like, sometimes people are signing up for the anti-Zionism or post-Zionism. I'm not questioning the intelligence of your followers, but I have actually, no, not at all. I'm just saying I've actually spoken with young Jewish people, and I'm like, well, say more about this. So I think I would like us, I'm actually going to be doing a post on this soon. I've defined DEI and I'm defining Zionism. I'm not the definer, of course, but I think we do need, in order to be having the same conversations, to be in the same dictionary, and to not give up on each other, and you know, to continue having conversations when it's hard to do. So many of the speakers this morning asked us to do a few things. I'm going to ask you to reach out to somebody whose political differences aren't the same, whose views are politically different than your own, and have a conversation and see how they're feeling. How are they feeling about Israel? How are they feeling about October 7th? How are they feeling post-election? How are they feeling about your decisions post-election? And we have to be the bigger people, because if we're not, you know, we're not following our cultural heritage and our you know, who we are as a people, but we'll also become even more fractured, and that is not something we can afford to do right now.
Thank you. You asked about Thanksgiving. I raised my hand. So I'm the guy that's supposed to promote civil discourse, but I have my own moments of weakness. I have two step siblings coming home to Thanksgiving. They're both involved with it, if not now. So when my mom says they were going to come down for Thanksgiving, I went online and I ordered my IDF T-shirt to wear to Thanksgiving. But I still might do that. But it's not the right reaction, right? We need to be able to have intelligible conversations, and I think the best way to do that is start by asking questions. You know, what's this past year been like for you? Where have you thought your attention? And I think the same thing is true with our national election, right? Democrats are saying, no, you're the problem, you're the reason we lost, you're the reason we lost, instead of just stopping and listening for a hot second and seeing, okay, what actually just happened here? So I think we do need to bring a concerted effort back to civil discourse, because I don't really think, a lot of us are thinking about how is this new administration going to change the local and the national environment, and it seems ripe for us to bring civil discourse back to our Jewish community. About 8 years ago, JCRC led a year of civil discourse across the Bay Area Jewish community. We're talking about bringing that back, because we know how many congregations and JCCs and local grassroots groups that are fighting on their WhatsApp groups and driving everyone nuts, right? We need to find ways to bridge past that and stop talking past each other. So thank you all for that.
Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry, I can't. I have been attacked more by Jews than anybody else, my friends. What is going on? What are we doing? I just had somebody, I did a post and somebody was like, well, what are you doing for Social Security? And I'm like, that is not my lane. That is not my area of expertise. What are we talking about? And so it's that other thing. It's like, I know we're sort of in this situation where we're all watching each other and listening to each other, but we also have to sometimes call each other in. Like if you see somebody attacking another Jewish person, it's like, my friend, let's especially if they're friends of yours, now is not the time. And it is also in those moments, now is not the time. And October 8th, now is not the time, right? We have to also pick and choose our moments of when we need to uplift each other and call each other in and call each other out and some of these other things. It's just been bizarre for me.
Couldn't agree more. About half of you were in the room in the beginning when I polled. The other half were on Jewish Standard Time, which is fine. And the first question I asked is, were there people that reached out to you and that you weren't expecting to ask if you were okay after October 7th? And then the second question was, of course, were there people that let you down? And most people raised their hands twice. Not everybody, but most people raised their hands for both. So I think it's important to start from a point of what went well. Where have friendships lasted, or where have we identified new friendships and new allyships? And let's study those for a minute. Here in the Bay Area, we've had a lot of success with the API community, in the South Asian community, the Hindu community. And I think one reason that we've had a lot of success is it has not been a transactional relationship. It's been about shared values. A lot of the grassroots groups focused on our public schools have found common cause with those communities in terms of the direction of our public education system when it comes to things like ethnic studies, right? And so there is a broader shared value or values that were identified that extend beyond the issue of Israel-Palestine or anti-Semitism. There's a bigger picture to study there. And if you look at the recalls of the Oakland mayor, good riddance, and the Alameda County District Attorney, who started those recall campaigns? The Asian and the Jewish communities of the East Bay, right? And so when I'm looking at my own study, and I'm going to ask you for each of yours in a moment, of where we've had success, it's where it's been more about beyond our needs or the other community's needs. It's about a shared vision or a shared set of values that extend beyond any one incident that's taking place. And you sure as hell can't build Rome in a day. If these incidents take place and those friendships aren't already there, you can't scramble to build them when you need them. And that's why this work has to be evergreen. And so I'm curious, let's go back in this direction. Where have you found success, and what patterns or lessons have you learned where, as we go back out into the world, because we're all going to go build more friends for the Jewish people after this panel, where have you found success and what can we learn?
Nobody's going to want to hear this, but DEI. Hear me out. As for those of you who are on Jewish Standard Time, I introduced myself, and I've led DEI for some of the biggest companies in the world. DEI is not affirmative action. It's a different segment. Affirmative action is inviting you to the party. DEI is, are you playing my music, letting me DJ, and am I having fun when I get here? So DEI is the place, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is the place where we can talk about anti-Semitism at work. And so as I'm trying to spread my message of what anti-Semitism is, who Jewish people are, how do we handle this topic at work, some of the best partners I have had have been the heads of DEI, the ones with big hearts and big minds. that know that that they don't know what they don't know. The smartest people in DEI have invited me in. If we're talking about the Bay Area, I think LinkedIn is up here, right? LinkedIn, you can go to LinkedIn Learning. I'm their course on anti-Semitism. Salesforce, Airbnb, pick some of the biggest companies up here. They have had conversations with us. The school districts that are doing some innovative things. So be surprised. And also be surprised that when I went to the DNC and Hirsch's parents came out to speak, it was standing room only. Everyone knew who they were. And as they told the story, there were people who were shocked with what they heard, which tells me that when people know better, they do better. And we've also seen more voices come up in the Black community that want to renew that covenant between the Black and Jewish communities. I used Van Jones as an example and surprised everybody with Patrisse Cullors earlier, co-founder of Black Lives Matter. But if you have questions about DEI and anti-Semitism, please come ask me. But that, believe it or not, the smart and impassioned people in DEI want to have more understanding and want to bring that perspective in.
So like I said, I kind of turned in a different direction. I looked towards Palestinians. I looked towards people who are more directly affected, including Israelis who are on the left of the Israeli political spectrum. So I have found a great deal I've needed a lot of comfort and sort of support along the way. And so for me to find hope, to believe that there would be something even beyond this, that we have a future, I needed to break through the noise, because I will say something I learned is that really obnoxious people are really loud, and they are not the majority. They are not. People want us to believe they're the majority, but they're really not. I've heard from people of every race, color, anything, nationalities, varieties of people who have sent me messages constantly to share their support or express their support for me, but they don't necessarily share it because we kind of live in a world that everyone decided that they had to be an activist, which is not the case. We really don't need everyone to be an activist. And I've heard from all different kinds of people, but I have found Palestinians to be the ones that give me a lot of hope, because they show me there's a partner on the other side in a hopeless place where you feel like there's nothing there, where you feel like only Hamas and the PA and their corrupt leadership and Islamism has infiltrated the entire society. And then you meet a guy like my friend Hilal, who's from Gaza, who has lost so many family members and who sits here telling me, I want you to be safe. I want us to be safe. I don't hate Israelis. I don't love the occupation. I don't like the IDF because my experience has been war. That's my experience with the IDF. But I don't want you don't deserve this. Your family needs to come home right now. And so when I talk to those voices and I hear, and look, he's someone who says the word genocide because he's a boy from Gaza and he lives in New York now, and that's what he believes. And it requires that I accept that in this context. It requires that I don't use, you said before, there's a time and place for everything. I'm not going to tell the person who's lost 30 people in their family that it's not a genocide in that moment. Maybe sometime in the future we'll break that down. But right now it's not the time. And I find strength in that. And I've also been illuminated to Israelis who sit more on the left than the majority of Israeli society, which is pretty much everyone. But people like Unacceptable, the group that's based out of here, who are fighting for it, they align with me the most. Pro-democracy. They want to save Israel and save Israeli democracy. And I have found such a great allyship and relationship with that group that I didn't really know existed until all of this. And so that has been really a gift for me.
So I found a really interesting alignment with a group that I never even thought about. And what I want to say is that perhaps I think a lot of times even in this conversation, I think we are talking about groups that we are all typically thinking about, groups that are familiar to us. But for example, last year but what I want to say is that there are others that perhaps we can think about. So last year, I don't know how many of you have heard about Indigenous embassy the Indigenous embassy that opened in Jerusalem. So has anybody heard about that? No? Yeah. So that was, it was, the whole thing was started by a friend of mine who is a Maori from New Zealand. And she has worked for years, and she has organized, I mean, she's really kind of stands at the center of this whole indigenous movement of the indigenous people from around the world who stand with Israel and who really dislike the way their narratives are being used in anti-Israel propaganda. Those of you who follow this probably know that kind of strand that, you know, the indigenous peoples should be standing against Zionism, against Israel, etc. But here's a group that includes, I don't know how many people, lots of people from around the world who come to affirm that, you know, Jews are indigenous to Israel and they believe in it, and they come and they support and they march in in support of us. And there was a beautiful opening in Jerusalem, and then just recently they organized, her name is Cherie Trotter, she organized an academic symposium under the auspices of the Jerusalem, of the Indigenous Embassy in Jerusalem, and again brought a lot of really interesting speakers. So that's a really interesting and important ally for us on one particular issue, and this is where we can be making friendships. I've heard since I've come to the Bay Area, I think I see my good friend Maury Shapiro over there, who I know has worked with the Hindu community. That was interesting. I had never thought about that. And I would say, I'll add one more thing. I think another thing that we tend to do is we tend to focus on what's going on the coasts and in the big cities and in the places that are really radicalized a lot of times, right? These Ivy League campuses, etc. But you know what? There is a vast country in between that may not be so radicalized, right? They may not have had so many encampments, and so therefore they don't draw our attention. But I think we should be going there, and we should be telling our story, and we should be educating people about us. Because, you know, left on their own, first of all, I assure you, and I know it, that the anti-Israel movement is reaching out to those campuses and to those places. But also, where do you think they get information about us? If you look at Wikipedia, at what Wikipedia writes about Zionism and Israel, it's horrible, right? 5.5 billion people access Wikipedia every month. That's basically the entire, you know, just a vast amount of the world. This is where they will be learning about Zionism. So even if these people, you know, you know, the flyover country, right? Even if they don't have any reason to dislike us, but this is where they get the information from. It's terrible. So I think we need to be reaching out there to places that are not radicalized yet, where people are willing to have conversations with us and about us.
And I just want to add one thing, because you mentioned the Hindu community. And if you've looked at Hindus on campus recently, what we're seeing is the same radicalization, the same language, the same animosity that they're using towards us. They are now flipping onto the Hindu community. So I have myself reached out to Hindus on campus and some of the other organizations that are watching what's happening to us. The same line of attacks are being levied against them on campus. And one of the asks that was asked of me that I'm just sharing with all of you, Hitler never said swastika. A swastika is a really important religious symbol for the Buddhist and Hindu and other communities. He said crooked cross, or hooked cross, excuse me. Hakenkreuz, I think is the word. And so I'd love for us to consider, you know, reframing that for them, because for them it's their own symbol has, in a way of allyship, or at least reminding people that Hitler didn't use that term. But I think the Hindu community is going to be one where because they had an October 7th in Bangladesh. Is anybody talking about that? No. So, yeah.
There was, we actually had a primary debate for the local member of Congress race that Sam Liccardo just won here, and there was an Indian American in the race, and he made a great joke. He said, if the Jewish and Indian communities stand together, we'll be 1.2 billion strong. And I got a kick out of that.
And not to compare anything to October 7th, that was a bad analogy, but they did have a horrific thing happen to them.
They did. It was awful in Bangladesh. So we wanted to start high, but we know that the reason a lot of us are here is wondering where our allies went. So we want to ask the opposite question, which is, and we'll start with you and go this way, where have we seen the failures? What are the patterns of those failures? And often we can learn more from our failures than our successes. So what are you internalizing about how this has gone for us?
I am really, as a mother of K-12 kids, I'm very concerned about our educational system. People are talking about DEI. I'm worried about and canceling DEI. I'm worried about canceling. Like, how do we get rid of the systems that are now indoctrinating young people with lies, basically, like whether it's Wikipedia or some of these other things, that we have entire systems that are ready to go to teach my kids something that is absolutely patently not true. So I worry about that. That's not about allyship. That's just, you know, it's a system, right? It's a system that's going to fail us, or is currently failing us, and how do we integrate ourselves? I'm very concerned with K through 12, because once the kids get to college, they're not, and that includes Jewish students, they are not ready to resist the draw of anti-Semitism, right? It's one of the world's oldest surviving hates for a reason. So, you know, making sure that we're running for school boards, running and being engaged in our local elections. I know that's not part of this topic, but that, if you're asking me what am I most concerned about, it's that. I am concerned about minority communities seeing what's happening in Israel-Palestine, and we overlay the black-white dynamic, and we're overlaying U.S. political systems and things like that on top of other countries inappropriately. That binary, the false binary of oppressed oppressor, it leaves little room for empathy. And it's not true, it's inaccurate, and it's totally, wholly inappropriate to be able to, you know, to overlay the U.S. experience onto Israel. And so I'm hoping that we can find ways to avoid that.
Thank you. One sec. So Roni was passing around cards. This is our last question of the group. So if you'd like one, please let her know. And if you have them, you can either hand them to her or just pass them towards the front and we'll grab them. Alana, please.
I think I can build a little bit on that, because I think breaking out of the binary and breaking minority communities, like the Black community, out of the binary, I think in America, the Black and Jewish alliance was the strongest, and it is important. I think we all saw it out of this election. A lot of people have seen that Blacks and Jews voted very similarly in this election. And what I see a lot of, what terrifies me, is not just within minority communities, but also across social media and amongst young people and Gen Z, this inability to recognize bigotry and xenophobia. I am horrified by the amount of times I see Israelis targeted, our businesses. And I just saw a video the other day of someone going into a self-defense class, and when she discovered that it was Krav Maga, which is Israeli, she ran out and made a whole video posting about, and I was like, how do they don't see that this is bigotry, that this is racism. Sometimes I will say, using the word anti-Semitism, it's too complex. It gets in the way of showing this is xenophobia. You are afraid of people who are from a different nation than you because you have a bias about them. And I saw that within the Black community because of this oppressor-oppressed binary. I shouldn't have had to walk around my predominantly Black neighborhood and feeling like I can't wear a David on my jacket. And I do feel that way in my neighborhood. At the same time, a lot of people in the Black community do feel a strong connection to the Palestinian cause, which is a righteous cause at its core. And we can't demand that they let go of that in order to be our allies. They should be able to fight for both of us. We should strengthen our bond with them by allowing them and showing them that you can support the people without being anti-Zionist, without demonizing Israelis on the whole, and show them a different path so that we can work with them.
So I want to say, kind of because the notion of demonization reminded me of this, that I think we as a Jewish community, first of all, I think need to be careful about not demonizing each other. And I think we do that. You know, there are categories that it's become okay to demonize them. And I say this recognizing that probably most of the group here is liberals. I, by the way, consider myself a liberal Jew as well. But I feel it increasingly uncomfortable when I see people demonizing the settlers or even demonizing Netanyahu. It's like, when we allow any group within the Jewish community to be demonized, and by the way, you could say that in Israel, the right wing demonizes the left, and they call them traitors. So when we allow any group within the Jewish community to be demonized, when we are doing that, we open the door for the entire community to be demonized. And I think we need to dismantle this thinking in our own minds, and the best way to do it is to actually get to know real people. So that's something I wanted to say. On the question, I think I'm just going to build on what I already said. I think we should be reaching out. I think perhaps my kind of this, it's not a regret, but I think what could I have done, or what could we have done as a community is, I think it's more of a sin of omission. It's failing to reach out to groups that could be our allies now, but don't know enough. Christian Zionists, I know it's another, for a lot of people, it's another problematic category. I think everybody should be making friends with them because they stand by us. And by the way, the young people in that group also are now being approached and approached by the anti-Israel movement. So they're turning against us. So I think we need to be overcoming our own barriers, right? Be they political or however, religious, emotional, whatever it is, in order to speak to groups who are willing to support us. But because we are not open to being with them and we have not approached them, we have not opened the door, perhaps alliances are not happening.
Thank you. I'll tell a quick story and then we're going to turn to questions. I was leading a group to Israel through my last organization, Wider Bridge. So I was bringing LGBT leaders to Israel. We went to an Ethiopian absorption center near Tzfat, and it went terribly wrong. We had several African-American queer participants. We get to the gate. They see this big fence surrounding the Ethiopian absorption center. They look up, and they see the Israeli flag is tattered. And then we go in and we meet with the group, and some of the white participants started taking pictures with the kids without asking for permission. And here the intent was to show the diversity of Israel, the multiculturalism that exists, the vibrancy of Jews from around the world making this place amazing, and the visual cues turn it on its head. They saw the fence and thought that this was a bad place. They don't know that unlike the American flag, where we keep it pristine, the Israeli flag in tatters is a sign of resiliency. And of course, there were some cultural competency issues in the group. And so what was meant to be a really impactful site visit had the opposite effect of what the intent was. And that was really important for me as a Jewish leader bringing trips, that intent versus impact are two very different things. And if we do not have the cultural competency to engage with non-Jewish communities, even if we put our best foot forward and we put our heart out there and we get vulnerable, it won't necessarily work. So we have a right to be angry about those that have let us down. But that doesn't mean that we also don't have more work to do, because there are other moments of acute vulnerability for other communities that they've also felt isolated. And now we know what it's like to have that shoe on our foot. So the message I would say is, I'm really upset too. There are a lot of people that have let me down personally and professionally, and we have to keep learning too, as hard as that is. So I have a few questions here, and ideally it's one volunteer per question, but if someone needs to get the word in, they need to get it in. The first one is, there's parts of the organized Jewish community that have strengthened alliances with the conservative Christian community and organizations, many of which are opposed to issues that, if we're talking about coalition building with the left, like reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, racial justice work, stand in contrast to that. So how do we think about movement building with Christians who care about and support Israel as we're holding these alliances with some progressive groups that we're also trying to court? How do we hold all of that? Does anyone want to take that question?
Everybody looked at Mason. So I think that, my take on this is, now is not a time to be applying purity tests. I don't think that we should be expecting complete agreement from our allies. We are not necessarily looking for friends who will be, there's a difference between political alliances and friendships. And I think if we have set as our priority, as our top value in this case, right, the support for Israel, then I think that if they agree with us on that, then we should accept it gratefully. And we can't expect people to agree with us on everything when we want support, if this is what's important for us.
Can I ask a question, though, about that? What if those people are allowing for Israel to move further to the right towards fascism? Because that's a threat to Israel and to the Israeli people. So I struggle sometimes with how do we then, if those people are condoning behaviors within Israeli society, I mean the government, forget the society, within the radical extremist settler movement that is moving Israel towards becoming a fascist society, then how can they be our allies?
Well, I mean, first of all, I really don't think that Israel is moving toward a fascist society. I truly, truly don't. My take on this is, Israelis have a very vibrant democracy. They really do. And I think that the Israeli people are making their choices. And I'm not sure that, somebody from outside can really move the Israeli society in one way or another. There are a lot of internal issues that Israelis make their decisions on. And I see it now that I live in Israel. From the inside, you understand that there are so many issues that are not really translating to the outside world. They are discussed in Hebrew, they are published in Hebrew language press. You kind of have to be on the ground to really understand how these decisions are made. So I don't see, just because they become allies, I don't think that they can influence voter behavior. I don't think, Israelis vote, right? They vote their leaders in and they have their considerations. So that's...
Alana, I'm going to volunteer you for this question. Okay. Coming from a high school senior that feels isolated sometimes in a public school with little to no Jews, what can I do? How do I inform people that I don't know if they care?
You just say it really honestly to them. How do I inform people that I don't know if they care? That's the question, right? I think, and maybe this isn't a practical answer, but you have to speak from the heart. You have to say, what I find we do in the Jewish community is we feel really protective, and we don't want to say how we really feel, which is, I'm really afraid, I feel personally attacked, I feel like my identity and the person that I am is under attack from society. That's what I'm experiencing. And I really need allies. I need support. I need to know that, not politically, but that you can support me as a person. And you have to start asking people a little bit more directly if they're willing to support you. And it's hard, but you just have to be vulnerable.
I was fired for saying that.
For saying what?
I need support. I'm feeling attacked. I think these signs does not recognize my intersectionality. I apologize.
No, I'm really sorry that happened to you.
The person in the
That
audience
is the risk
just
that you
mentioned-
take, but
I'm sorry that happened to you, and maybe we should talk offline after the session about how we can help you out with that. I have a what about question for you.
Are we doing whataboutism? Really?
We're doing what about. What about the Jewish colleagues of Black Lives Matter who were kicked out for being Jewish? And we can add the Women's March to that. We can add different progressive movements. I think it gives us hope for you to talk about the co-founder of BLM.
Yeah.
What about some of the broader sticking points within these progressive movements that are opposed to us? How do we navigate those two truths?
So I think this relates also to the question that you first answered, is keep showing up. Obviously, if you're fired, you're not going to keep showing up. If you've been physically threatened, you're not going to keep showing up. I had tickets to what I thought was going to be Hillary's inauguration. I have tickets to what I thought was going to be Kamala's inauguration. And I went to the Women's March anyway, knowing that there might be factions that were anti-Semitic. And I will show up and I will speak anywhere, almost anywhere, because I'm still going to say what I'm going to say, right? Did I, you know? And you're still going to hear some of those voices. If you really care about bringing different voices in, you're gonna bring different voices. And obviously, this is if you're firing Jews from Black Lives Matter, if you're uplifting anti-Semitic voices in movements like the Women's March and another DEI event I went to recently, same person was highlighted in both cases. Then I showed up and I went and I spoke to the creator of at least the second one, and I said, hey, have you considered anti-Semitism in your work? I didn't address the fact that they had a rabid anti-Semite on their panel. I simply said, because I'm a Black Jew, and I would love to talk to your audience about anti-Semitism. And why? And he hadn't thought about it. So if we're not showing up and if we're canceling everybody, then they're not going to see us, hear from us, or think that we care. And I also want to encourage all of you, leverage your multi-ethnic Jewish voices, invite in your Jewish queer voices, your Jewish liberal and progressive voices, and that will also help you manage some of these ideas about us of being white, colonizing oppressors. Who knows what people are saying, but I speak up and I speak out. So continue doing that. Continue showing up, even when it's hard to do.
Thank you.
Say more. Someone said it really works.
It really works. I've worked in a highly anti-Semitic, non-white environment, and when I stood up and showed I cared about the people I worked with, the entire picture flipped.
Yeah, staying quiet has never helped us. I mean, unless you're hiding in a basement, does not help. Or an attic, excuse me. Right? Speak up and speak out and be loud and proud. And people don't always know we're Jewish. They're just make a lot of assumptions about us, and then they realize this person that I've worked with all this time, I love them, and they're really cool, and they're not whatever, and they're a Zionist too. They're not at all what I pictured a Zionist to be, right? So yeah, I think
People are products of what they're exposed to, so expose them to you.
legally.
Love that. I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't waste our community's efforts where there's a firmly closed and locked door. You know, there are a lot of people we can be building relationships with. If they're not interested or they just simply don't like us, there are other places we can turn our attention. But my question is, when is that door unlocked or just ajar? How can you identify someone that we've had differences with, we've been hurt by, or has a very different opinion than us, but you think that there are signs that that could be someone successful to engage with? What do you look for when you're trying to determine someone that is outside the tent or just on the margins of the tent that we think is worth our time? What would you be looking for when you process, your emotional energy towards this and think about, is this worth my time? How do you process that?
I can do that. Respect. Are they willing to respect me? I try to maintain boundaries with people who want to talk to me or want to lash out at me, and I always say, I'm not your punching bag. If there is someone who cares passionately about, let's say, the Palestinian cause, but they want to use me as their punching bag, then that door is not open because they are not receptive. You have to look for people who have a level of emotional intelligence and self-awareness, and ability to reflect and say, oh, maybe I'm wrong. There are a lot of hard-headed people out there who are just unwilling to hear you. They want to be heard, but they don't want to hear you. So I think these are really just sociological, behavioral cues that you have to, and I have learned to get attuned to and to pick up on. I do some sort of I'll test the waters, and I'll kind of, if they lash out at me, I will go back to them with something really personal and emotional that isn't arguing with them, but is the way that you're speaking to me is extremely upsetting, and I'm not sure why you're attacking me this way. Is there a different way that you want to have a conversation with me? And I will pose a question back to them to see if they will reflect and say, you're right, I'm so sorry, I was really heated. and I've done this with Palestinians before, will keep going. So you have to give people the benefit of the doubt, but don't let them ever disrespect you.
I'll just, I want to tell a story. I mean, I completely agree that I think you look for signs this is a person who is intellectually curious, first of all, because someone who is, whose mind is filled with slogans, they're not going to be, they already have a perfect picture of the world, right? In which, like, everything, exactly, like everything Israel does is motivated by evil designs, and so that's already, that picture is closed. I was recently speaking at Carleton University in Ottawa, which is a very difficult campus in terms of anti-Jewish sentiments. And at the public talk, I gave 2 talks to students, and then there was a public talk. And at the public talk, so I was giving a history of Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda and how so much of it, the channels through which it was directed to the global left and what was called the Third World back then, and then from there kind of descended down the generations from the 60s down to our time. Anyway, so this guy came up and he said, I'm from Syria, and I grew up with what you're describing, all of these anti-Zionist slogans. I was taught that when I was growing up. And then I realized that it was propaganda when I moved to Canada. And I said, well, how did you understand it? I was really curious. What is the point at which your mind begins to change? And he said, it was one wonderful experience. I was invited, I met a Jewish person. It may have been the first Jewish person ever he met. And they invited him to Shabbat. And they had a really good conversation, and they gave each other a hug at the end. And he said, you know what, that hug dissolved years of propaganda. And so I think that these are, but he obviously was open enough, right, to take up the invitation and go to that Shabbat dinner. So I think that these are the kinds of people we're looking for.
Thank you. Isabella, last question goes to you. And I'm reframing your question, David, which is, we saw the attack in Amsterdam. Horrific. And it's no secret that a lot of the anti-Semitism that we're seeing there is from Muslim immigrant communities. But I think we as a community are often afraid to talk about this because we don't want to be perceived as Islamophobic or being anti-Muslim, but we have to be honest about where a lot of that threat is coming from. So how do we navigate that issue while also being sort of mindful of how we show up as a community? Anyone else welcome to take it also. Go ahead.
So I would say that, we do have to address it. And I think one way to think about it, and this is a new thought for me, and by the way, I'm not an expert on Islamist anti-Semitism, but I've seen some investigative journalism that's been done in Israel, a really amazing report that was done already 10 years ago by a journalist an Israeli who came out of family came out of an Arab country, so he speaks perfect Arabic, and he goes underground and kind of inserts himself into a lot of these communities in Europe. And what I understood, to understand, what are they doing, how are they thinking? And what I understood is that it's not so much that it's just Muslims, right? But it's Muslim Brotherhood, which is a particular movement with its ideology. And I think that perhaps if we address it that way and begin to speak in those terms, because that's an ideology that, by the way, I think would gain us some allies, because a lot of people in the Gulf states really understand the danger of that movement. So I think that is perhaps one approach.
Well, that's time. I want to thank Alana, April, and Isabella. And all I want to say before we go to break is don't give up. This work has gotten harder, but it is still essential holy work and part of our mission as the Jewish people. So think about where you have an open door, where you can make a difference. You can follow these 3 on social media. They're doing great work there too. But keep up the good work, everyone. We have to keep our heads up. Thanks for being here.